So this is my reflection and commentary on the Proverbs. I'm on chapter 31, and I'm on the last section. Now this is likely to be the last episode that I will do on the Proverbs until I return to it at some point at a later period in my life and go over it again. So I wonder where to start. Of late, I've been beginning these podcasts with a prayer. I've said my prayer in private today. It's always a fascinating thing. I suppose it's fascinating to think that if I ever come back and listen to my voice at a particular period in life, and I think about what I was thinking at the time, surely I would want to have a voice that gave some reason to it, that gave some idea as to what I was going through and what I was feeling. So to give a little bit of a context, both for myself at a later date and also anybody who might find this, it happens to be a Monday evening after work. It is a shortened work week this week. It was one of those Mondays that had a difficult start to it. Attentively, it was a rough go. It required a prayer to begin the day, or to begin the work session, let's say. And those moments, although I find distressing at times, because it can be so difficult to focus the attention, it can be so difficult to calm the heart and constrain the emotion. But this was one of those days. And at times I wonder to myself, is this emotion going to get the better of me? Am I going to lose this battle? The battle for which I know that I must be oriented towards good. I must have my relationship with God at the forefront of my decision making. The reason that I do things is for that ultimate purpose. It is to move closer to God, to feel more deeply, to connect more strongly, and to solve more gracefully the problems that present in life and throughout the day. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. So this is verse 25 of chapter 31 of the Proverbs. Just a general recap of where we've been. Chapter 31 is a prophecy. The first verse, the words of King Lemuel, the prophecy that his mother taught him. And so it goes through a few different items, but eventually it winds and centers on a woman. Beginning on verse 10, who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. And so, from verse 10 all the way up until now, we have been discussing this woman and her virtues. Much of this has been centered on, as is often the case, attention, industriousness, sacrifice, wisdom, discipline. And there's been throughout this strong symbolic threads that have been useful to follow. And in the spirit of this, we are going to continue. Near the end of the last episode, I raised a theme that is common among my reflection and interpretation of the Proverbs, that I personally view the Proverbs as a key. Each and every one of them has the potential, or at least they mostly do. There are sometimes verses that are fairly hollow. They might lead to another verse, but for the most part, the verses have something interesting to say. And much like with a key, it's not so much that the key is the thing that gives us the answer. It is the environment that we are exposed to when that door opens, unlocked with the key, that we are then able to play in that abundant playground of rich symbolic pasture. So in the beginning of this verse, the first half of this verse, strength and honor are her clothing. There are many layers, I think, or many levels that we can try and interpret this on. Some more superficial and some deeper, some more principled. It is my inclination that I wish to find the principled ones. Strength and honor are her clothing. So the axis here is clothing. Much depends on understanding what this symbol can possibly mean. So let's work our way into this. Now I happen to be wearing clothing. I'm in my work clothes. I still have yet to change out of them. And so there is a question, are we speaking of clothing in the way that I am wearing clothing right now? And I think the answer is yes. It is yes, but. And that but has to do with a lot to do with the symbolic significance, the broader implications. Now, there are plenty of reasons that we wear clothes. Not all of them are important to the interpretation of this verse. If we think physically, strength and honor are her clothing, it wouldn't quite make sense. Honor is not something that is a physical object. Strength, we can contribute, we can say, associate with a strong material object. But of course, the physical imagery that clothing brings up is not sufficient to understand this on a deeper level. Now, at one level, the fact that she wears her clothing in a particular manner, it has symbolic significance, so extends well beyond the physical, but it may begin at the material level. We are material beings, after all. And in fact, a few of the previous verses have centered on the clothes that this woman wears. Some of it has to do with her skill in making clothing. Some of it has to do with the delicacy, the types of clothing that she wears. But when we think about the purpose of clothing, it is something that covers us. It is something that keeps us warm. It is something that protects us. It's something that shields us from the view of others. It protects privacy. It maintains privacy. It serves as a barrier between the inside and the outside. And so we quickly move into this identity domain. And as we've discussed in the previous episode, at the root of identity is the idea of sameness. that there is a certain continuity of anything that can be identified. And it is because of that continuity that it can be identified separate from other things. I see plenty of identities in front of me, many material objects. There are some objects that are quite similar, and yet I can recognize distinct identities. For example, I'm looking at 3 different types of chords. They are all different types of chords. They're all different colors, and they all have a different diameter, let's say, or width, or circumference. And they are, because of this, they are distinct by their size, they are distinct by their color, they are distinct by their purpose. But internally, they have a consistency that allows them to be separate from these other chords. Now, why do I mention this? Because clothing, much like the chords in front of me, is something that covers, is something that provides that outward appearance, or just generally appearance, because it's easy to say when one says an outward appearance that there's a superficiality to it, and this is not what I mean to imply. I mean to say that outside of experience, thingness appears a particular way, and it appears through that representation of clothing. Experientially, maybe we wouldn't necessarily speak of it in terms of clothing, but observationally, clothing, I think, is a good symbol. So how can we then conceptualize strength and honor as bits of clothing? Well, if we are to say from the external appearance of an individual, just observing them, if we think about what covers them on a symbolic level, symbolic layer, that what really exemplifies their identity as something that is strength, and that's something that is honor. How does this appear? In the same way that a red collared shirt might appear on an individual. Well, beginning with strength, without looking at a formal definition, there are many different ways in which we can use strength. In terms of behavior, we find it valuable when somebody exercises strength. When somebody takes initiative, when somebody is certain about where they are going, somebody that is declarative, principled, somebody that can hold adversity without crumpling under the weight of it. To see somebody clothed in such a garment would surely spur thoughts and ideas of trust, of wonder, admiration. And that of honor, again, an idea that must necessarily involve principle. To have something so closely at the heart of oneself that their actions their behaviors, they stem from this internal consistency. And it's, in a way, it's an enhancement of their identity. It is the structured sameness that people, when they come back to, they understand this person. They are reliable. There is this word respect that comes to mind. For somebody to have honor is somebody to have gone through experience, to have learned, and to be able to go back to something, a principle again, like I mentioned, and to bring it forth, and to apply it to different situations, to different experiences, to different problems. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. So why? What is this word rejoice? What does it mean? It implies, I think, a celebration. It implies that something difficult has been undertaken and accomplished. It is a time of being thankful, recognizing what we all know to be true, but perhaps at times we are not able to bring it to the forefront of our minds as we ought to. And so, much like honor, or the term respect that is buried within honor, rejoice has this prefix re. And there is an inclination there that calls us to think or to look back. Almost a reimagining of the definition of joy. At once, it may be difficult to define an emotional state, sure, but it's not just something that we boil down to an emotional state. There are reasons for which one ought to be joyful. There are plenty of reasons, perhaps, that an individual who experiences joy ought not to be experiencing that type of emotion given a certain context. There are also many situations for which people feel joy, elation, at times that are quite appropriate. But in our particular situation, the thread of her identity that forms these garments through strength and honor, she has found herself in this principled domain, surrounded by strong pillars about which the challenges of life can do nothing to break. They may modify them, hopefully for good. But strong principles stay where they are. Another way to think about this, I think, is in light of happiness. Happiness is something, in my experience, I found to be intermittent. It's not a state that one can occupy all of the time. It would be difficult to say that right when I wake up at 4:45 in the morning that I am happy. I may be content with the way that things are going in my life, but happiness is a word that is reserved for particular situations. And the same, I think, is true with the word unhappy. But all the same, happiness is something that is afforded. It is something that is earned, let's say. And that process of rejoice, I think, is returning to a place of happiness that we all know, we all perhaps once knew. And when we find it again, we have this elation, this excitement of the heart. And I think it is through those principles, through the covering of those principles, through strength and honor, that we can come back to the state of happiness. We can continually come back to that state of happiness. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. So what a verse this is. Quite large symbolic structure that we have here. So taking the first part of this. She opens her mouth with wisdom. So if we think about it sequentially in terms of the cause, and I think about my own experience about opening my mouth, what do I do it with? I can say that I do it with muscles, mechanical cause. I can say that I do it with purpose, spiritual cause. And of the spiritual cause, I can identify a few different things. The reason that I do this now is to learn, is to grow, to move closer to God. And so in this case, what can be said of the way that I open my mouth? What do I do it with? Spiritually. Because of course we all know that we do it with muscles mechanically. I can say maybe that I do it with a particular spirit. But what spirit is that? The spirit of desire? The spirit of desire for goodness? Who can claim that somebody opens their mouth with wisdom? Somebody who does it, I suppose. Easier to be an attribute than to some self. Characteristic. So wisdom here is seen as a tool. Another analogy I think that I can make, I suppose, is that I open a can with my hand. The hand is the tool. Or I open the can with a can opener. The can opener is the tool. And so wisdom as the tool, quite an interesting tool. So far I've been defining wisdom as this process through which the eyes see. They see the relatedness among things. They identify the causes of their relation. And by wisdom, they wish and they desire towards good relation. And so they use their vision for further reciprocation, growth of the network that they see, whatever the case might be. So this necessarily means then, as one speaks, as one generates productive information into something that is meaningful, i.e. speech, the very mechanism, the spiritual mechanism, through which this information flows is facilitated by the filter, or through the filter of wisdom. The hand of wisdom, the mouth of wisdom. And so that when the speech and the information that is encoded in the speech lands on the conscious minds of others, lands on we could extend this out quite far, I think, lands on purposeful behavior enacted into the world. What begins to happen is change. It is change towards some positive event, some positive outcome. In the sense that any particular node, let's say a human being is a node, the information finds these people. It orients their attentive environment towards goodness. And by that, the human being's relationship with the environment around them, human being or otherwise, it could be just inanimate objects that they articulate with, but it's by their articulation and the way that they articulate that they can do good things, that they can do beautiful things. And it is facilitated by this: how do we open a can with a can opener? How do we develop good relationships? How do we develop solid governance structures? How do we develop good societies, strong families, strong people? Through wisdom. And in her tongue is the law of kindness. So again, this trope that we see often in the Proverbs, the difference between the mouth and the tongue. I think it could be said that the mouth, at least in terms of its relationship to language, is the reservoir. It is the acoustic opening on a guitar. It is the thing that allows speech to be heard and resonate. The tongue is the thing that separates out meaning from just noise. It is the specific notes. It is the way that the notes are constructed. It is the grammar. It is the words themselves with the meaning that they hold. The tongue does all of this, manipulates, it cuts, directs, outlines and defines. And so again, thinking about the tongue in this way, that upholds some sort of law, some sort of structure, barriers. About which, around which, the structure of understanding and intelligibility itself is bound. Now, it is not necessarily the full of intelligibility, but it is the particular aspect, the law of kindness. And within the word kind is the word kin. Within the word kin, there is this special relationship. A special relationship affords special attention. Special attention opens up the heart, opens up the mind to the types of interactions and experiences that cause us to love, that causes us to be empathetic and to wish to hear the voice of another, to participate with them. She looks well to the ways of her household, and eats not the bread of idleness. So today happens to be a new day. A new day, new thoughts. So I like to bring this segment, recording segment, into its productive place by beginning with a prayer. So, dear Lord, I thank you for this day, and I thank you that I can be here. There is not often where I find myself in a place how to word this. It is not often that I find myself in a place that I have capitalized productively on the time that is given to me throughout the day. It is often the case that I do complete my work, that I do make time for important reflections, for prayer, and for Bible study. But it is not as frequent as I would like to really grasp at the time that I'm given and to explore it. And today is one of those days where I have found myself in a place sufficiently called to participate with you. And this is something that I am thankful for. And for this I pray in Jesus' name, amen. So I'd like to continue this thought outside of the prayer. But of course, when does the prayer ever really end? It ends only when we decide it to end, when we feel that that reflective potential has come to an end and that it is time to move forward. But prayer or not, I would like to continue with this idea of capitalizing on the time that we have. Now, the thing that I find interesting is within this word capitalize, as colloquial as it happens to be, there is a sense in which it's anything but capitalizing. But there's also a sense in which it is, to the strongest degree, a capitalization. Now, it's not, of course, a capitalization in the sense of monies. There is value being transmitted, but it is not through fiat, it is not through currency. It is not through material, it is through the mind, it is through thought, it is through reflection. It is something that is spurred by the heart, facilitated by our soul. And as I find myself now organizing my scattered thoughts into something that is coherent, the energies of mind, with all their doubts, but also with all their beauty and potential, I have but to choose a fundamental desire about what I wish for this session, for this recording. And it is for goodness, it is towards my relatedness to God. And there's something special about this verse that I think deserves some time to think about and reflect on. She looks well to the ways of her household, and eats not the bread of idleness. So this is one of these verses that I think ties a lot of the previous verses, or many of the previous verses, together in this chapter. And by this I mean we've spent a lot of time talking about the virtues of this woman, about her productive energies, about where she places her time, about her discipline, what exactly that means for her and her family. She looks well to the ways of her household. What comes to mind is the question, what are the ways of a household? This brings to mind the analogy between the house and the home, that there is a big difference between whether it be the concept, the physical structure, or the actual spiritual habitation that is the home. when we think of household, it's a similar term as what I've been using as the term home. The household has many different components to it. There's an identity of it. It exists of many different parts. It is a dynamic sort of thing, constantly shifting and changing. There are also ways that the household remains still. It remains stationary. We could think about this in a principled manner. And here my mind wishes to go in two different directions. One of which would require some context. The first has to do with the analysis of a close friend group that I have and the household that is formed, that I am sort of peripherally a part of. I'm not as intimately a part of as my friends are, in the sense that within this layered structure, my friend group at its core is a family, and I've sort of become a part of that family. The other path that my mind thinks about is my family, my biological family, and the way that I participate with them. Now, my biological family is small, and I suppose there's a way in which I can analyze the extended household of my family, since I'm not a teenager anymore. I'm not in my 20s. I'm a bit older, so in a way, I sort of have to imagine this as an extended household, as the family unit is something that I can identify, and as the way of this family unit is something that I could further identify. There are plenty of events that underlie, as they all do, the formation, the structure, the current way of this relational structure that is my family. On one hand, as I think about it, there's almost a lament at the state of it, but also there is a sweetness that is there. As I think about my friend group, I think about the intricacies, I think about the layers like an onion. I think about myself as this observer of how the family is almost centered around the matriarch. And while there may be disagreements, there is always a continual thread, this love that penetrates all of the members and keeps them together, keeps them bound together. So with this, I still wonder about the way of a household. For what image suits us best here? Is it the image of an archetypal character that is moving forward out into the environment that is the conscious landscape, or into the world? In this way, we can almost physically see the character walking through life. There's a way in which the way it conjures up ideas of a map or of a GPS system, directions that will move us in a particular direction towards a specific location. There's also this aspect of the way as a sense of being. That is, there is this undercurrent of being, of different personalities that interact, a general sentiment and feeling. And throughout this meshwork, that at once if we find ourselves too zoomed in, we may miss the broader picture, but at the same time, if we zoom out too far, we miss understanding the finer components and the structural aspects of a household, But regardless of this, I mentioned that what is interwoven, that is consistent among the various threads, is the thread of love. Now, perhaps I can't say that in all cases, but in the case that I imagine, both in my family and in my extended family, let's say, this is true. And it must be true of the situation that we speak of now. Since we were speaking of the virtuous woman, we were speaking of a platonic ideal. She looks well to the ways of her house. And so I think about a person that takes time to think about her behavior, her actions, as they relate to her skills and her discipline. What she does will have an effect on the way of the house. It'll have an effect on the way in which it is woven, sticking with the fabric analogy. And of course, the way that something is woven means quite a lot to the ultimate purpose of the thing that is created. Now, if we think about a sock, for example, if we start where I had mentioned, on a quite local scale, almost a microscopic scale, we begin with a very small piece of thread. We begin with the idea of the sock. It is not until we start weaving the fibers together that something starts to become something. And it takes some time, I think, for the structure to be identifiable in and of itself. But all the while, that form and that conceptual identity can never die. Otherwise, the structure, the participatory structure of the thing will die. She looks well to the ways of her household. I think it is often the case that within dynamism, maybe it is just me, but in the cases of dynamism and change, it can be a bit disheartening, especially when we lose focus or lose attention on the things that actually move us and give us purpose and meaning. And I have to imagine that this virtuous woman always has her eye on that thing, not only that binds, but binds in such a way that affords a type of beautiful connection. And I suppose it can be asked, well, how does this translate into daily life? I think there's a certain peace of mind, a sense of certainty that comes with it, in both music and also in our physical dealings. When we come home, or we find the root note, it is something of a place that is familiar. It is a place that we can rest, that we don't have to be constantly on guard, let's say. Guarded in the sense that if there is some sort of intrusion, that intrusion potentially threatens perhaps a sense of stability of mind. For example, during my working hours, during anybody's working hours, I think we all put on a degree of a face. And this face is meant to ensure professional participation, let's say, to solve problems adequately, to remove the parts of ourselves that may interfere with good judgment. And this is a good cultural apparatus to have some purpose, to have work to do, to have responsibilities. But what are these responsibilities? What are these efforts? Without understanding where the sacred is. What does that mean? I mentioned a moment ago about the root in music that may define a particular key that we're playing in. However, when I mentioned that this root may provide us, or this home base, let's say, may provide us with a sense of relaxation or security, perhaps this is only part of the equation. Because the root, home base, may be a turbulent place. It may resolve itself to a place that is certain, but just because something is certain doesn't mean that it is enjoyable or that it feels good. And of the household being a dynamic thing, I think there are plenty of instances, both in my childhood and in the experiences and memories of many, that have found themselves at home in situations much contrary to that of the ideal, loving, and nourishing environment. And here I both mean to imply the process of a dysfunctional household, but also of those general moments in life for which we have to account for our failures. Perhaps we did something wrong at school. Maybe we got into a fight. We misbehaved. We misjudged. And we have to go home and face our parents. The discipline that is awaiting us. The shame and the consequences that we know is going to wash over us. And yet all of this exists at the home base, at the place that we may feel that it is the sanctuary. And so I say this to say that within the dynamism, within the continually unfolding experience that is a household, just because something is rooted, and even because something is principled, doesn't mean that it will be I have to be careful with my words, because right here is extremely important. If I say that it's not certain that it will be secure, perhaps this is not completely true. If I say that our home may not be, or may be comfortable, or may not always be comfortable, this is true. But in there, within the dynamism, despite the possibilities for a destabilizing event, the rootedness, I think, is meant to bring us back to a center place. A good and virtuous woman, a disciplined woman, will understand that this is true. While she may not enjoy disciplining her kids, or she may have to have a difficult conversation with her husband, she does so not because she wishes to sacrifice the sanctity or of the, we can say the way, the general spirit of the household, but she does so because she knows that for the way of a household to be good and to be sacred, to be for God, there will be correction that is required, both of oneself and also of those who participate in the structure. And that may be something as simple as re-engagement, because participation, I think, is one of the key things that defines the way of a household. How can one understand what the spirit of a household is, or how it consciously communicates, or the what we might say today as the vibe of a household, without discussion, without attention? It's nearly impossible. It is impossible. She looks well to the ways of her household, and eats not the bread of idleness. Now earlier when I mentioned that this verse has an important meaning to me, not that the other verses don't, but idleness is something that I find, especially as I get older, something that I think more and more about. Idleness of mind. And the difficulties here with idleness and the judgment that lies within it, if one is honest, is that it can find us even in the participation of productive behaviors. I've noticed at times when I'm communicating with somebody or participating at work, I can find myself in a passive posture, that I can lean back onto something that is certain, something that is known, lean back on experience. And while this is in a way a good thing, it is in a way also, if used in a particular way, a bad thing, because it blinds the eyes to the dynamic project of being aware of things that are important. I'll give an example. Somebody had told me, this happened a few times this weekend and last, where somebody had approached me, and it was with a topic of a particular personal weight, which sometimes happens in my field. Actually, it can happen frequently in my field. And because of my comfort with a particular flow, a way of things, let's say, I was not prepared to accept and to listen in the way that a proper listening or even response would require of me. And so what does this mean? There's an equivalence, I think, that can be drawn here to this verse. But that idleness, the passive just running of the engine, while it may be producing things, it is doing so passively, and it's a sinful sort of thing, because if I'm unable to recognize goodness for the sake of an ease of being or of expressing purpose, then perhaps there is something that is being reduced in that purpose. Now, it doesn't by the same token mean to imply that everything in a dynamic process needs to be uncomfortable and overstimulating, or stimulating in general. But it does mean to imply that of those moments where the mind has realized something of a change that needs to occur, it is a new responsibility. And just because it is uncomfortable in that moment doesn't mean that it should not be accepted. And there are various ways in which this idleness has permeated my mind. I found even at times in reflection, while the desire may be there to explore something great, my mind is incapable. Now there's some grace here surely to be had. But the incapacity is difficult to pass over if it is born of a lack of effort, let's say. Now, I think there's a little bit more to be said about how this is structured symbolically. The second half of the verse, that is. Eat not the bread of idleness. So breaking down maybe causally or sequentially, when we consume something, when we eat something, we do so for a particular purpose. It could be enjoyment, but largely it's because we wish to sustain ourselves. It is something that is needed so that the body and the mind may continue to function and to experience things. So this is not something that is a simple matter, something that can be denied or overlooked purposefully. It's something that must be participated in. And in the modern world, there are plenty of things that maybe appear to us that it is a necessity. I think of all of the various material goods that we have. And many of us, and myself included, probably believe that many things of a material nature are necessary for our lives to continue, maybe to continue in a particular way, but it is in fact the case that many things are not needed. But it puts things into perspective when we consider those things that we must participate with that are not those things that we participate with that are not optional, that are necessary for our participation. So if we put this in a different way, she looks well to the ways of her household and participates in a fundamental process, participates in the maintenance of being. That is, of something that is other than absence. Now that is sort of a convoluted statement, I recognize that. And there's a way in which this verse is actually prompting us into a consideration of something a little bit more difficult. And I think that there is this concept of something being optional is important here. Because we're speaking of the bread of idleness. Now, the bread of idleness is something that we can consume, much like we can consume a cupcake, for example. While consuming a cupcake may not in and of itself be a bad thing, in excess, surely it will be. Or just generally, we can think of any series of behaviors for which extended participation in them leads to negative outcomes. Drinking soda, smoking, eating a lot of processed foods. We understand these things to be contrary to our health. And so this would be participation in a physical sense in idleness, let's say, because we're not participating in the fundamental necessity of the behavior. Now there's a certain Puritanism that can be found in here that I don't necessarily wish to associate myself with. But there is also, if that is the case, there is also a fine line between establishing those things that are absolutely fundamentally necessary and those things that we allow ourselves to participate in that are superfluous. But they would only be superfluous from certain contextual standpoints. In the way that they are necessary, they must be embedded in some broader procedure of connectedness, let's say. So if we were going to participate in eating a dessert, for example, maybe we do it in a social setting. So it is not primarily to satisfy some superficial appetite. Something, of course, that I am guilty of. I've gone to the store many times to pick up some ice cream just to eat by myself. But the action of participating in something that is euphoric can be seen as a way, much like social drinking, for example, can be a way of bringing together a group of people. Now, this is not a perfect analogy, I suppose. There may be some holes in it, but as far as I can determine, eating from something that is negative will surely bring us negativity. Eating from excess sugar will give us diabetes. Eating from idleness will give us absence of mind. It'll give us the lack of production. It'll give us defection in the heart's expression and relation to others. Idleness can be the enemy of life. that there is something so fundamental about activity and exertion to our experience that in absence of it, we diminish the experience. This is another thing that I think I plead some guilt to. I'm quite an introverted person. There are plenty of things in my participation that I just don't. I know that I ought, but I know that, but in practice, perhaps, it doesn't come to fruition. It's something in my journey and in my process of becoming a better faithful person, believing person, that I correct these errors. But I know that I fail often. Her children arise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. So this clearly seems to be like an extension or a culmination of everything that we've been experiencing so far in this verse, or in this chapter. So I think it's important that we think about the term blessed. It's a loaded term. This is one of these terms that I feel like I come back to time and again. I always seem to forget an exact definition, but perhaps an exact definition is not needed. Sometimes it's contextual. Often it's contextual. Now here we're not talking about God per se. God's hand is involved in it, but we're speaking about her children. And because of the thanks and because of the admiration that they have for their mother, they call her blessed. So what is this state of being blessed? Just from an introductory standpoint, when I think of being blessed, I think of being given something. I think of being aware of something. I think of the recognition of oneself obtaining something, but obtaining something, the recognition for the obtaining is in the qualities that were outside of the individual's control, let's say. Now here I'm thinking specifically about the hand of God and how this, the threads of this find its way into our lives, into the level of agent that we are, at the level of experience that we have. I think there's a lot of perspective, potential for perspective seeing to be had there. However, for a child to say that their mother is blessed, they are seeing something. They are recognizing something that is given to her. They are recognizing something particular about her behavior, about her way. So if I quickly do a Google definition of the word blessed, it is to be made holy, consecrated. Now, to consecrate something is having been made or declared sacred. It is to place it at a particular junction in mind. This junction for which our very identity, our very deepest thoughts about our existence and concept of self rest upon this consecrated plane. Not to say that we worship ourselves, that we make ourselves sacred. There is a degree of that sacredness there, of course, because we have the soul. There is that connected point to God. So I don't mean to say that in a conceited manner, that man is this blessed being, blessed in a way for what we are given, for our potential, for how we can be, but not blessed in all situations, I suppose. So the children, by the behavior of this mother, by the expression of her virtues, are declaring a sacred place, a place of recognition that surely comes from the love that they have for their mother. Her husband also, and he praises her. So to praise is a form of recognition, directed recognition. It is to identify those qualities that are admirable, those qualities that provoke the heart to joy, to peace, to satisfaction. This verse is followed up with the verse, "Many daughters have done virtuously, but you excel them all." Or excellest is the word. And so this could be the praise of the children, this could be the praise of the husband. But generally this affords us another opportunity to talk about virtue. Now in the context of Aristotle, virtue, or arete, is the golden mean between two extremes, that of excess and that of deficiency. Virtue is not just about doing the right thing, but being the right kind of person. Someone who habitually acts with wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. And all of these things, I think, are displayed in this chapter, in one way or another. We have these items that are associated with the divine feminine. There's overlap, certainly, as man, as accompanying, or including, rather, both male and female, overlap in these virtues. But of the woman that we have discussed in this chapter, we have diligence and industriousness, we have compassion and generosity, we have wisdom and kindness, we have faithfulness and fear of God, we have strength and we have honor. Verse 30, "Favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman that fears the Lord, she shall be praised." So let's determine why exactly favor might be deceitful. In my experience, I found that there are times the possibility arises where I may do something well and I may receive support from somewhere, favor from somewhere. It could be a superior, it could be from a client, it could be from my own prideful expression. But nonetheless, this favor can create an environment of, I want to say, conceit. Conceit in the sense, in the defined sense, as an excessive satisfaction in one's achievements. And even if the favor that has been given, let's say externally, or maybe favor given by God, let's say there's a blessing bestowed on us, a gift, our response to that favor, that support, is to use it to prop up ourselves, to selfishly use something that is true to form a concept of, much like we were talking about earlier with consuming desserts for the sake of pleasure versus, or solely for pleasure, versus that sort of communal bonding experience through which we all sort of go through this pleasureful experience together. It creates a state of mind that is enjoying the environment, And in that company of people, we can afford strong experiences. But as it is had alone, for the most part, this superficial satisfaction and self-gratification does only enough to distract the mind from maybe the pains of the day, the anxieties and the worries that plague it. And although leisure and rest is an important aspect of our experience, and while there may be some small place for that there are plenty of other outlets that are more productive. Sleeping being one, reflecting, prayer, all of this sort of thing being of a higher, I think, moral outlet. So when we go back to this favor, I see it in the same way, that it serves two possible masters. One is the selfish gratification that leads the mind towards absence and lack of attention. The other is a tool, a stepping stone, a reinforcer for some righteous behavior, true behavior, through which we wish to model again in the future. But we ask ourselves, we reflect, okay, so I was given support because of this. Why was I given this support? How do I maximize my behavior in such a way that I may continue to receive favor and support? But again, there's a very delicate balance here, I think, between the former of the selfish gratification, the expansion of pride into conceit, and doing so for the sake of being connected and growing that network, that wisdom network. Favor is deceitful. So in what way, then, can we bring deceit into this? There's a way in which I think I touched on it, but I did not follow it to its conclusion. So deceit is something that tells us one thing. It tells us a lie for some alternative purpose or motive. Favor is deceitful. Now I wonder here about the expression, favor is deceitful. Mathematically, there is an equivalence between that favor and deceit. But we all understand, after going through the Proverbs, that for something to be true, it is likely necessary that it must be placed in an appropriate context. If the context changes, then the statement often changes. Unless we have a very solid principle, which is possible, but even solid principles are subject to contextual variance. And when I see favor as deceitful, such a declarative sentence, my first instinct is to say that, well, favor is deceitful depending on the context. But then I don't want to find myself in a territory where I'm not trying to interpret this to the fullest extent. But by the same token, speaking about favor, just reading the definition here, approval, support, or liking for someone or something, an act of kindness beyond what is due or usual. Feel or show approval or preference for, give someone something that they want. Now there's a few definitions here which I think make it a little difficult. If we take the first definition, contextually speaking, the support is not something that is, in an absolute sense, a deceitful thing. It can be. The second definition, I think, is more appropriate to more of an absolute statement. An act of kindness beyond what is due or usual. Now, within usual, there's some contextual liberty there, I think, but in terms of beyond what is due, I think is where the deceit comes in. It could be, if it is just kindness on the part of an individual, I think the self is tempted to deceive itself, because they believe that what they have been given for what they have done is appropriate to what they have done. Unless they are of strong mind, then they can recognize where the appropriateness of favor has been, or has been given, let's say. And when we move into this word deceit, the Google definition of the word is the action or practice of deceiving someone by concealing or misrepresenting the truth. Now, although it may be a relatively minor situation, in the most benign of situations, we can extend that out into the most severe of situations, but beyond what is due, I think, is a misrepresentation of the truth. Now, in terms of reinforcement, if somebody is continually given praise for something that they have done that is beyond what they deserve, then this is going to reinforce a type of belief in oneself that they're more virtuous than they actually are, that they participate in a particular skill or in a particular way in a family, let's say, without realizing the true impact of their behavior. And what begins to grow is this sort of tumorous idea of self-worth, of virtue, of moral standing. And to be deceived in this way is a terrible thing, because the realization of such a thing will require the transformation of the self. Now, transformation of the self is not a bad thing, but a sudden realization of where one is relative to the way that most people believe things to be, if one is at a sufficient deficit of that, there will be a psychological harm that comes from that. So favor is deceitful and beauty is vain. Now this for certain I know, that we cannot draw an absolute equivalence. So this is less of a principle in that way and more of a contextual principle. Because beauty is something that is such a fundamental component of what we understand to be good. In fact, good things ought to be beautiful. But the point of this part of the verse is that of things that are meant to enhance our experience, enhance our connectedness to God, there are those situations for which favor, for which beauty can be used against that purpose. Now, specifically, since we're talking about women have a particular way about them, and that there are many beautiful women out there. And their beauty is something that can be recognized by the self. I've seen plenty of women that get entranced with themselves, that they busy themselves with cosmetics and attractive clothing, and they spend hours making themselves look or try to look more attractive and more beautiful. And there is an obvious vanity in that. Now, if we look up the word vanity, a simple Google definition, pride again comes to mind. It's excessive pride in or admiration of one's own appearance and achievements. The second definition is the quality of being worthless or futile. Futility or futile means pointlessness or uselessness. Now, in what way can we imagine a person that participates in beauty in this way as being... I wouldn't want to say that the person is worthless or useless, but the participation, the purpose of the participation is useless. So there is something within this prideful behavior. Now, much like conceit, it's defined fairly similarly. That conceit is excessive pride in oneself. Vanity is, again, excessive pride in or admiration of one's own appearance or achievements. Pride is defined as satisfaction in one's own achievements. So vanity and conceit are sort of the advanced or the highly expressed forms of pride. So as we near the end of this chapter, this is the second to last verse, we are afforded one more opportunity to think about pride, something that is quite common in the Proverbs. Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. And so one must wonder about this pride. Again, as an inclination, pride is a natural thing, to be satisfied once we have finished something that we have worked hard for. We can say that it's a matter of degree, that at a certain degree it may become sinful, or we can say the absolute satisfaction at anything that we achieve is the thing that is sinful. I gravitate more towards the former, but all the same, even in the case of the former, I think there has to be an eye towards the next thing, so we don't get stuck in our own bubble, our own internal sense of self. So when we enter this domain of the self, into this bubble, as we might call it, there's something about satisfaction that can become poisonous to our experience. And my question is, well, in what way does satisfaction become poisonous? Given that attention is such an important aspect of the faithful life and of epistemology, I think here, when we speak of pride, attention is something that is closely related in the sense that there is a causal relationship. When one is satisfied with anything that they do, the heart begins to produce the affections towards this satisfaction. And so then when we have these emotions, when we have the desires that are set following an achievement, where do they find us to be poisonous? We should be thankful for a moment that we don't necessarily have to understand all the intricacies of our internal physical environment to understand the causes here, because here we can rely on our experience, our spiritual experience, our experience of being an agent at the level that we experience it. And I suppose there are all sorts of different levels that we can approach this. That I may be satisfied when I achieve something, and so as I move around in life and in space, I attribute to myself a greater degree of value. Again, it's that deceit of favor. And favor in this situation is coming from myself. I am favoring myself. Now, much like in the pursuit of science, understanding something almost requires us to move outside of ourselves so that we don't use the self as a deceitful agent, that it doesn't blind us. I think in a similar manner, although we don't deny the self, the heart and its participation in response to something that is achieved by us, I think ought to be one of embrace rather than selfish consumption. And so what we feel is satisfaction for where we are, but most importantly, where we are going. And there's the understanding there that what we have done is not the end. What we have done is not to do with the matter of social standing or personal virtue. What we have done has moved us closer to God, and this is the thing that should satisfy us. It is by this relationship, by this affordance, by this sacrifice that we can feel proud without it being something that destroys us. And beauty is this physical expression of one possibility of being prideful. And it's quite an important one. When I think about our culture these days and the various terrible outlets through which people express themselves physically, value themselves physically, for attention, for money, whatever. What that does to the mind and to the internal expression, I think, can only be described as destruction, a war on what the self's conception is, a distortion of that internal face. Favor is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman that fears the Lord, she shall be praised. Now the interesting part about this verse, or the beautiful part about this verse, is the risk that we discussed earlier in the first half is still there. She shall be praised. Now this praise is another potential source of pride. It's an expression of warm approval or admiration of. Now the fact that this is coming outside of the self's conception is important. But the possibility of it provoking inside that selfish desire, or the self-lust, let's say, is still present. But what mitigates against that is the fear of the Lord. It is the continual reference to law that is, I could say, outside of oneself, but that's not entirely accurate because it is written on our hearts. If we choose to listen to it, it is there for us to be able to see. And what I mean by this is that there is a way of understanding and of balancing the self such that we do not fall into this prideful, conceited state of arrogance that will blind our eyes, that will reduce our reason, and that it will turn something that ought to be good, like beauty, into something so terrible as vanity. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. So this is the last verse in the book of Proverbs. Verse 31 of chapter 31. And I wanted to give a bit of a conclusive error to this last verse. And let me check real quick my process. This has been a long road, reading the Proverbs. And I'm very curious as to how long this has actually taken. In January, I was in chapter 20. And it seems that in August of 2023, I started this journey. So almost 2 years I've been engaged in speaking about the Proverbs. And it has been a wonderful experience. This has been a long road, surely. Many things have been discussed, many things have been learned, There have been some days for which I have found it difficult to exercise my mind, to focus my attention. But all the while, this process has been an exercise in doing just that, despite my difficulties. And it is for this that I am thankful. I thank God for this experience. So let's finish this verse. The plan from here after we are done is to go into Plato. I'm not sure how long I'll be there. I don't wish to depart too long from Scripture, but we will see how it goes. Give her of the fruit of her hands. You know, there's a lot that can be said about the fruit of one's hands. I was thinking, it happens to be the afternoon, or the evening. It's about 8:30. It is after work. It is the middle of the week, Wednesday. And often, perhaps not often as I should, but plenty of times there is this reoccurring thought in my mind about the way in which I exercise my hands, the way in which I exercise my productive potential, the way in which I extend creation out into the world, both the positives and the negatives of my experience. I tend to be quite critical of myself. And, putting this criticality aside, I suppose that really doesn't matter in terms of what I wish to say. But as I think about it more and more, there really seems to be no limit in terms of what one can commit themselves to. There may be a limit in terms of what one may accomplish, but the mind can dream quite large. And given that one accepts and sacrifices requisite to achieve their goals, there's a lot to be had in life. As a general statement, give her of the fruit of her hands, depending on the person. They'll depend on what is given. But seeing that we're talking about a virtuous woman, a woman that devotes her life to the productive ends, to the industrious ends, what she has given is what she has produced, essentially. Now I pause here because in the thought of our potential, and the thought of what we can do with our hands, and in the thought of what we can do in the mind, just sitting and reflecting on things, I wish to not explore this in a superficial manner. I wish to find something that resonates with myself and potentially can resonate with another. Perhaps that word resonance may lead us to an interesting place. By resonance, I mean something that agrees, something that finds a home, something that is useful, something that is generative. And here I think about wisdom, and I think about that network that is produced by various nodes in that network. The nodes can be objects, they can be material things, or they can be people. People and biological things, I think, often provide the most interesting nodes that we can imagine in a particular network. But among her family, the virtuous woman's family, much of her energies, as we have seen, are towards the productive building of her family, of that network. It is by her care, by her attention, and by the facilitation, the orientation of these nodes, through her skill sets, through her desires, that bring them together and facilitate a strong, coherent network. Again, the example of the sock, through which there are these multiple threads interwoven in and out of each other. I've used that analogy in a few different situations, circumstances, but nonetheless, she has given this experience and this structure to a group of people. And by her giving this, of course, she has woven herself into it. When we speak of giving, when you give part of yourself is in whatever you have given it to. So if you have given yourself to wickedness, a part of yourself is in wickedness. If you have given yourself to God, you are in God. You are with God, let's say. And since she has given herself to virtue, given herself to her husband, given herself to her family, and to her skill sets, pieces of her are all around this territory, all of the things that she values. Give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her own works praise her in the gates. Now, when the gates were mentioned earlier in this verse, in verse 23, her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. It's interesting that we see the word gates again, but in this context, I think heavenly gates, more so than I think about earthly gates, in the sense of city gates, which I think was the reference to the husband. But I also think that we can also consider how that the heavenly gates might relate to her husband, but nonetheless, we now have the opportunity to think about the divine gates. But more broadly, the symbol of the gate. So in the case of verse 23, her husband is known in the gates. If he is known in the gates, then it is likely the case that he's going to be let through the gates. If he sits among the elders across the land, he has a degree of relationality there, positive relationality. And by these relations, he is accepted. But to be accepted at the gates and to be let through is not a simple matter. I think there's a broad symbolic implication. And what is implied here is that a gate is an entry point to a body. The walls surround a town or a city to provide protection, but they also surround it and give it an identity, because there is this barrier. On one side, there is the outside. On one side, there is the inside. On the inside is everything that is considered to be valuable. On the inside is everything that is considered to be part of that collective identity. That is the city. Now, of course, the city extends outside of that to a degree. It must necessarily do so to include the farmers and everything. But the cultural centers, the civic institutions, the marketplace, the interactions among peoples, the majority of that takes place within the city center. Now, this analogy is not something that is limited just to the city. This is something that we can extend to ourselves. This is something that we can extend to the divine gates, the divine identity, let's say. And let her own works praise her in the gates. An interesting conception that if we think about our works as singers, or as people that display the various behaviors throughout our lives, it is in that sense when we walk in front of the judge, we walk in front of the gates and we are judged. And we are looking to enter a place of salvation, a place of heavenly leisure, I guess, or heavenly rest, maybe. This judgment is full of bizarre, perhaps painful, but also beautiful statements. And if our works are good, this praise is the elevation of those aspects of self that have led to the execution of such things. And in the reverse, the damnation of those parts of ourselves for which the failure of our behavior influenced the more foolish or wicked aspects of our identity. And so this concept of letting in, of letting a person participate in a broader identity, a broader purpose, whether it be a city or of that divine city, the heavenly city, it is the same, but just different as a matter of degree. So I think I'm going to end this series here. It is a bittersweet moment. I feel particular emotions. I feel a bittersweet, a bit of a melancholy in the bitter sense, a sweetness in the sense that I am thankful for the experience. And so for anybody that may have found themselves at the end of this, I thank you. And I will see you next time.